So to get started here, I am joined by my co-host Marty Behrens, who has been doing a lot of work recently in creating new ways of imagining how we can get better information and better participatory journalism, or how we can make better decisions, how we can develop collective wisdom. And Marty has a Substack, which I believe is what, Reinventing US, Reinventing
Reinventing
Us,
us. Yep.
and also Local Sense News. And you can tell more about that if you want, or you can introduce me, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if any of you have been here before, you know that Brandon's put a tremendous amount of work into this sense making and thinking about all the different aspects of it. Um, and we've known one another now for about, I guess 3 years now. We've been doing really community-based projects at the same time as having a lot of deep. One of those projects is a politics and philosophy group where we have a lot of really deep discussions that sooner or later get around to sense making. So it's a real pleasure to be here today, and of course to be working with Brandon again. Um, it'll be interesting to see, particularly as we get to the end. Really keen to hear your feedback and questions. I love the way that I don't know what it is about Zoom, but it always turns my mic's volume down, and then I have to turn it back up again. Yeah, so great to be here again for part three of this. And this time we're going to get into some discussions more toward the end about maybe different ways that we can start making sense together and what it would take to do that. So, so Brendan, I think you're going to start with a bit of a summary of what we've done before.
All right, so this is part three of integral sense making for global and national events. And so just to recap what we talked about in parts one and two of this series is that sense making includes the mutually interdependent triad of evolution of information, such as sensory data, truth claims, intuitions, etc., collective decision making, and the practical implementation of decisions. And in mainstream media and social media, we are constantly being bombarded with claims, a large proportion of which are untrue, misinformation, disinformation. Far too many people in countries that are supposedly democratic, free, and fair are doing poor decision making, poor sense making on matters of public concern. So this is exacerbating many existing crises because bad decisions are being made by poor political leaders, and these people are not being held to account for poor decisions. So a person's ability to rationally make sense of news, information, and claims depends on their level of cognitive, emotional, and ego development. So we're looking at developmental. This is where I'm sorry, what's it called? The GPS, like where are you oriented within? I think there's a term for that. For some reason, I can't remember. But your level of development and your level of understanding plays into where everything is, with your capabilities and your orientation to the outside world. Um, Integral address, I think that's what it is. Um, and it is important to consider the developmental attitude of each individual and also their peer group. So this is not just an individual matter, this is a peer group matter as well. And this is where worldviews come into play and value memes. But just to look at the problems of collective sense making overall. So sense making include just a moment. So our sociocultural fabric is held together through collective sense making, and our collective well-being, including our ability to maintain peace and stability, depends on the sociocultural fabric in which we are embedded, and which we often take for granted. And we can see this fraying before our eyes. So this depends in large part on institutions that are seen as legitimate and trustworthy. So now the sociocultural fabric is a non-tangible lower left phenomenon, but it is supported in part by upper right institutions and the way these institutions are interwoven through legal, economic, and governance frameworks, which are often lower right phenomena. So the upper right institutions are only effective if they have broad support among the population because they are seen as legitimate and trustworthy. And this has been breaking down across the board. So, for example, news media, there's a pervasive lack of trust in media outlets. Many popular outlets only offer partisan propaganda. So many media outlets are seen as ideologically left and progressive, but there are certainly some that but there are certainly some very popular and therefore effectively what we can call mainstream media outlets that are ideologically right and conservative. So this gets into what is mainstream? What is the mainstream media? How do you define that? For some, maybe you have some of these alternative media sites that are so popular. Maybe they're what passes for mainstream now. Although, to a certain extent, there is like, okay, the legacy media plays into that because they have the most uh, cultural prestige within our society. These legacy outlets, such as what, I don't know, NBC or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times. Probably have to figure that most of those legacy media organizations are, left of center, but some of them are right of center. But the ones that are, the most popular in recent years, maybe Joe Rogan is mainstream. We don't know how to define that anymore. So, whereas some decades ago, there were media organizations that were seen as objective and credible to people across the political spectrum, that is no longer the case. And I want to also recognize that there's not just one political spectrum, but just to kind of simplify things, I guess we do have, in many countries, including the US especially, there's two main parties. In other countries, there may be more than two, but to actually probably be a little bit more US centric for this particular conversation, because there is so much wealth and power that is coming from the US and so much political upheaval, especially in recent weeks. So we don't want to exclusively focus on the US for this conversation, but that's the center of the focus here. But there's probably nonetheless more than one dimension of this political spectrum, just to acknowledge that. So now it seems that most people now tend to only believe sources that tell them what they want to hear. So that's a huge hit to the institution of news media. So we could also look at academic institutions, which are seen by many as socially radical and culturally elitist. This one is really unfortunate since we desperately need good educational institutions now more than ever. This gets to what Zach Stein refers to as the breakdown of teacherly authority. There's also been a lot of damage done to the credibility of courts of law, especially in the US. They are seen by many not as objective law interpreters, but as politically partisan. Um, so I'm not sure how much this applies to other countries, but it certainly applies to the US. Some decades ago, courts and judges in the US were generally seen as nonpartisan and objective interpreters of the law, but they are now seen by a lot of people as just politicians in black robes who have the power to strike down laws based on, partisan justifications rather than, okay, well, I mean, you pass a law that is unconstitutional, then there should be, recourse to that. But that, we've seen probably situations, a lot of people would argue that a lot of the times that the Supreme Court strikes down a law is not based on that. It's based on, what is politically convenient to their party or their ideology. So there's also been an attack on scientific institutions. There's widespread agreement on what legitimate science is versus pseudoscience, and what scientific or institutions or scientists to trust. Scientific research institutions, whether they be government run or connected with academia or other or part of some independent nonprofit organization, are often running up against the culture war, wherein many people don't want to believe their scientific findings if it is inconvenient for their political agenda. At least some of the time, probably some research and professional scientific conclusions are ideologically driven. And it can be difficult to sort out good science from bad science. There are some people who want to broadly attack and attempt to discredit the professional scientific community and scientific research institutions and want to instead advance quack pseudoscience because they are more concerned about fighting the culture war than appreciating the advancements in knowledge that legitimate science is giving us. Another important institution that is being attacked is those that are curating history and are analyzing history. So because he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. People are driven by the sense of what has happened, how we got to where we are, and what factors and forces created the time in which we are living. This is important for people to orient toward the future and to have some sort of conception of how to work toward the future. Our conception of the past is constructed from historiography. Now, this can be in some ways likened to it's not kind of science. Well, it's a discipline anyways. It is should be evidence-based. It should be conducted in a rational, good faith, and evidence-based way by people and institutions who are capable and work to be objective. It can also be done in a bad faith way, with propaganda, with the weaving of false histories and the editing out of information that is inconvenient to those in power or those who wish to be in power. We've seen quite a bit of this happen in recent years. The very institutions that do history professionally are being attacked as well. So finally, spirituality. So these are institutions that help us figure out what is our common purpose, what is ultimately meaningful and valuable to us. And for many people, there are no answers. So this has been there's been a lack of faith in legacy spiritual institutions that were supposed to help people orient toward what is meaningful and valuable in their lives. Mainstream religion has became highly dogmatic centuries ago. But if we go back far enough, it was more community-based and more participatory. In recent decades, it's not only been dogmatic, but a lot of religious denominations became highly politicized, which is cynical. There might be a way of reviving spirituality to become more community-based and more oriented toward participatory meaning making as it was in very ancient times. But the only institutions that are facilitating this sort of thing are quite small, and only a small percentage of the population are involved with them. Not sure if you have any commentary on any of this, Marty?
Well, I think you've done a good job now of summarizing, both the problem we identified as well as some of the findings or discussions we've had. And so I guess what we're doing now is we're kind of moving into this like we've done before, where we look a little bit of frameworks that are around to help us make sense of things, or how do we know things. We spent a bit of time on the John Vervaeke's 4Ps, and now we're going to look at, I think, a bit more at Wilbur.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really what we're trying to do there is just really offer up this insight that some of us or most of us may have, but sometimes forget, is that there actually are frameworks and tools we can use to start sorting things in different ways, rather than being, caught in the whirlwind of what I think most of us are feeling often these days, this whirlwind of information, whirlwind of opinions, and people breaking out all over the place with emotional reactions in situations that seem disproportionate to the reality. And we're confronted with this, really down to earth difficulty, given everything that Brand's just gone through on that slide. It's a wonder we can make sense of anything, right? And yet, part of what we're trying to argue is that it is actually possible to make sense. And there are tools and methods as that we already have. And I guess where we're going is also near the end. I'm going to throw out some ideas about how I think we could do some new things to make sense.
Excellent. Yeah. And so we're gonna look at what Ken Wilber has given us from some of the books that can then be we can look at how sense making can be done that then in turn might help us evolve some of these institutions that have been fraying or create in some cases create new institutions. So that's a different conversation. But one important thing to take away here is that our sociocultural fabric does depend on these institutions in their own right and also how they interact with each other, how those patterns of interaction work. So that's an upper right and an upper left phenomenon. So we won't have, the level of peace, what remains of our ability to have peace and stability in the world without that. So looking at Wilber's three eyes of knowing here, we have the eye of flesh, the eye of reason, and the eye of contemplation. So this then in turn has the gives us the ability to connect to the pre-personal, the personal, and the transpersonal. So this graphic here comes from the book Eye to Eye. There is probably a correlation that we can offer to some of the other frameworks, like in the past. I think it was maybe in part two that we talked about uh, Vervaeke's four P's of knowing. But one interesting thing is that there might actually be more than one P, like participatory and perspectival knowing that can be offered uh, from the eye of flesh, from the eye of reason, from the eye of contemplation. And that most of the time we need things to work to be in a propositional content, like it needs to be constructed somehow into language, into something that we can talk about in order for it to be move into the more lower left like community, so it's going to start like this is what you find here. Most of this is an upper left phenomenon. These are you have the eye of flesh, eye of reason, eye of contemplation, which they are both perspectival and participatory, and but that there can be like procedures through which this works better, through which you can understand, go through these procedures. And this is something we're going to talk about on the next slide, are the procedures for doing this. And that this in turn creates these propositions that we can communicate and we can get on the same page with each other and we can start to build these communities. So Marty, do you have any commentary on this graphic?
Yeah, I wanted to point out, I think it's at least on just in terms of weaving different frameworks together as we have been. Um, there's something important here about this word transpersonal and even paradoxical thought and gnosis. Transpersonal immediately it points to this idea of, between you and me, or between us, all of us, in the us, in the we. And that's I think a really difficult thing, and we'll talk more about it as we go, but making sense of the world through that relational focus, through that connection with other people, um, particularly on a personal level, on a community level, um, really points back to, well, what are our community or group contemplative practices? How do we come to know things and trust things at a deeper level? Rather than, as you were pointing out, this dependence on propositional knowledge, which, requires me to be logical and rational and capable and intellectual and decisive and concise in my thinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of the things that we rely on for uh, our highly performative and instrumental modern society. Um, that ability to know things in a deep way through and with our relationships is maybe doesn't come as naturally as perhaps it could. I'm
Yeah.
just going to turn off my camera for a second. Hold on. You keep going.
Yeah, and what I was thinking was that, so the participatory knowing, just to clarify, that's where it's oriented toward resonance and fittedness within the agent arena environment. So it is an integration across the left quadrants and the right quadrants. And the perspectival is much more of an upper left phenomenon. So that's that, but it needs to start from participatory knowing, and then it can move into more providing this sort of a perspective of what it feels like, what you're experiencing, in consciousness. And so some of these pathways actually from the left, from these, the eyes over to this, these epistemological relationships as they're given here. I think all of these pathways can be perspectival or uh,
Participatory.
participatory. And some of them can be augmented, some, not all of them. I think that if you're looking at the bottom line, the pre-symbolic, that's not going to, it's pretty much outside the realm of the propositional. But the propositional can help. But we tend to get so propositional and reduce so much to propositional in our world. We're losing sight of how this really works, in terms of the lived experience of building communities. We have the ability to scale up our community building through that, but we don't want to actually move away from that, because we are going to move then away from the genuine transpersonal capability, which is it is more of a participatory phenomenon. Do you have anything more to add to that, Marty, before I move to the
No,
next slide?
no, that's good. I'm happy.
All right. So Wilbur is offering us three strands of valid knowledge in The Marriage of Sense and Soul, which is actually one of my favorite books by Wilbur. And so we can start looking. This is kind of a reverse engineering of how several of those. I was offering categories of institutions in an earlier slide where we had, okay, scientific institutions, journalistic or information gathering vetting institutions, media outlets. We have institutions working on historical knowledge or other forms of research in academia. Okay, how do they go about doing this? You know, so this is it's kind of an all quadrant process, but it does start from instrumental injunctions, which is mostly okay. So that includes upper left emotional state orientation. So sometimes you need to be in the right state of mind or the right emotional state in order to really be able to observe or take something in, or have other forms of knowing that, to go back to the slide here, is it the eye of flesh, reason, or contemplation that we are bringing in this information? Okay, so this to start from mostly at an individual level, because this sort of a thing probably needs to start from an individual hold on, and then somehow move into a social hold on. But to say, okay, we have that emotional state, and then we in some cases it depends on a cosmic address. I'm sorry, that's the word I was looking for earlier. Cosmic address, wherein you're not going to expect, or maybe it's impossible for some people to even be able to experience or observe certain things unless they're at a certain developmental state. So that is going to play into this. Now within these scientific and academic institutions, they don't typically do that very much, but that maybe they're studying different phenomena. So within the some of these spiritual communities, that is important. So that you reach to a certain altitude of spiritual capability, so that you can have those experiences and you can recognize that. But I want to say that most of the important stuff that we're missing in our society that's breaking down, it doesn't depend on a very high level of developmental processes. For many people, I would say we need to probably be at a certain kind of post-conventional understanding of what like Keegan level 4 or 5, which is like okay, because at Keegan 3, that's like conventional, that's socialized mind, but for the people who are at least capable of like really understanding science and having this sort of um, self-authoring capability. That's important there. And there are many stages beyond that. What Keegan recognizes only a fifth, which is the self-transcending, and other systems such as Cook-Greuter or Terry O'Fallon. There are even further stages, what we maybe could call post conventional. Much of that is important for deep spiritual insights, but for a lot of what we're dealing with here with information evaluation in journalism and science and history, we don't need to be at those sort of post conventional levels. We probably though need a large number of people in our society to at least be at this what Keegan calls self-authoring mind and self-transcending, which is probably aligns more with like this spiral dynamics teal, turquoise level integral thinking. That's very important as well. But at the very least, we need a lot of people to be at the self-authoring mind, and not a lot of people are. So that's important to all this. Okay, that's important to the injunctions. And in some cases, okay, I just wanted to round this out by saying we do need the upper right technological devices to make proper measurements. So that's part of this. The first step here, the instrumental injunction. Second step would be direct apprehension. Okay. Once we have done these injunctions, we do have these eyes of flesh, mind, spirit, that in which include both participatory and perspectival knowing, in both the upper left and upper right. And to a large extent, this is going to need to be codified or like described somehow in propositional terms. But it's really it starts from the perspectival, the participatory, using the eye of flesh, the eye of mind, the eye of contemplation. And then number 3, we have communal confirmation or rejection. And this is where things move into the lower quadrants, the lower left group evaluative processes, the lower right information ecosystems. And this is also participatory and perspectival. But again, it reaches the most capability when it is in propositional form, but we don't want to use these, mistake the propositions for the experiences upon which they are based. And we can also note that this whole thing here, steps 1, 2, and 3 constitute a certain procedure. So that rounds out Vervaeke's 4 Ps of knowing. And there are many procedures within this that this is just like kind of the meta procedure here. Within science, within historiography, within journalism, and other forms of other disciplines, there's going to be other kinds of specific procedures that you're going through. So you can kind of think of it as like it's all a wheel. These are cycles, but there's wheels within wheels, and there's wheels within wheels within wheels, and it's generating more knowledge, and hopefully it's generating more community and it's strengthening the sociocultural fabric, or in some cases repairing the sociocultural fabric so that we can live in peace, so that we can have more peaceful, more just, more sustainable living. Hopefully. Not always the case, though. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I move on, I want to ask Marty, do you have anything to add to this?
I think between this and last time talking about for Vervaeke's 4 Ps, it's interesting just to stop and I'm curious, and from other people later, is how much any of us actually stop when we're trying to figure something out and apply a framework like this, or take a look at what are the strands of valid knowledge we're dealing with? Um, I don't know. For me and most of the people I hear, sometimes it seems like most of us are just dealing with an onslaught of news that comes over our phones. And, maybe we've got time to do a little bit of research, or maybe we go listen to three or four opinions, um, and then have to come to some conclusions on our own. And I think that's an interesting statement about, as you were saying in the beginning, the dissolution of basic human to human community based systems where we make sense together, and instead be overwhelmed with the way digital media, the way everything's turned into ones and zeros being delivered over the exact same device. And what that intermediation, what the media does there, going all the way back to, what's the message in that, right? That it's all coming at us like that. And I think the message itself is there's no way to make sense of this. I feel like our information environment is constantly saying, yeah, you're not going to make sense of this. And so it's interesting. I'm trying to figure out how you apply this to that situation, right? Um, and I do think the communal confirmation or rejection is, the lower quadrants are just poorly used, right? We depend on institutions in those quadrants still, um, and maybe we depend on the clickbait of social media or digital media to take our attention, but the actual community processes uh, aren't there.
Yeah. And we'll get into more of that in a couple slides here.
Yeah. And your next slide is gonna talk a bit about where we are.
Yeah, some of you guys might be familiar with the so-called Overton window. That is, Joseph Overton came up with this idea that there is bounds of acceptable discourse, and that there are certain things that are outside of that are, unthinkable or unpopular, and that sometimes this can shift. There are ways in which the Overton window can shift. Now, what's actually probably been happening more so in recent decades, not quite so right now, as far as I can tell, is that different people of different worldviews and different ideologies, political partisans, they actually have different Overton windows within their communities, but they overlap a little bit, okay? Or at least this is how I think it was throughout much of my life. Now I'm a Gen Xer and remember the 80s and 90s and you know at least the first few years, the first decade or so of the 21st century, where I think this was happening. They were not exactly on the same page with each other, different parties, different ideologies, but at least there was, some overlap. Um, and we can also look at though at there's sometimes an illusion wherein I'm sorry, Marty, did you want to maybe
No, no, keep going.
Okay. This illusion wherein you think you're doing something to move an over that has an impact on someone else's Overton window. So you have this illusion that you're on the same page when you're actually not. No, we brought in this graphic here, and we actually just had to look that up yesterday. I was trying to understand. I don't quite recall what we were saying about this illusion.
Well, the idea is that we're arguing about something and we imagine we're looking at the same territory.
Yeah,
Right? We think we're arguing about, we could argue in our current situation, we imagine that we're arguing about the same territory. For instance, I'll give you a concrete example for me. I'm listening to JD Vance in Munich at the security conference talking about how he's upholding democracy. And I go, hey, I'm upholding democracy too. Hey, yeah, that's great. Right. And there's this attempted, it's almost gaslighting, right? But there's this attempted sense of, well, we're talking about the same thing, aren't we?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
what's actually happening though is that we have non-overlapping over Overton and Windows because the signifiers we're using don't refer to the same thing at all.
Mm.
There's too much misinformation and disinformation, and what people talk about things they are not they're maybe using the same words or the same phrases, but they do not refer to the same realities or the same imagined realities. So we have an epistemic divorce. Um, and this isn't just to look at things, linearly. We don't want to reduce it to that. I mean, the original version of this graphic we had, it had like, between revolutionary and reactionary, and we had to edit that out because we knew that would be misleading and not probably very helpful to think of that in those terms, given our current political upheaval that's going on within the United States. But we do, if there's at least two ideologies, and maybe there's four or whatever, there could be, okay, there's more traditional conservative, whatever neoconservative kind of thought. There's culturally progressive. There's socially progressive, or economically progressive. There's libertarian, etc. Okay, these people aren't always talking, in the same universe of discourse, especially the ones that are highly popular. What the ones the ideologies aligned now with what the Republican Party has become or what the Democratic Party has become. There is an epistemic divorce, and that may well also be the case in other places in the world. I'm not quite sure how well this applies, but this is kind of the reality that we're seeing. We're not even on the same page. We're not even in the same ballpark. Do you have anything to add, Martin?
Nope.
Okay, so moving on here. So there have been changes in information paradigms. And so the predominant model in the 20th century was the so-called information gatekeeper model. So I was reading about this in some books on this recently. In the information gatekeeper model, there are professional journalists and a limited number of major media companies in print, radio, and television, and notably, there is competition among them to gather, vet, produce, publish, and broadcast reasonably accurate and reliable information. So the people generally trusted this legacy in media from its inception in about the 1880s until the early 2000s. And indeed, there was a period of wherein there was very a proliferation of what we can call yellow journalism in the early 20th century. But there's a reason why that was mostly became discredited by the late 20th century, because it got regulated to less respectable tabloids and fringe outlets, and there was an attracting force that encouraged major media organizations to at least have a good faith effort to be professional, respectable, and accurate. Now, no, I mean. I want to say that the word objective doesn't necessarily mean completely lacking bias. There is nobody who is ever going to be completely lacking bias. And in fact, if you didn't have a bias, you wouldn't have any kind of orientation or perspective onto the world to begin with. But there are good faith efforts that institutions and people who are working for them can have to be more professional, more respectable, more accurate. And the dynamic led to them competing with each other to be more credible in that regard. So information was curated by professionals who had the ability to filter out unpopular views. So that was one downside of it, is that you didn't have those, less popular views rising to the top. So that was kind of the situation until and the Overton window was also narrow in those situations. You had high trust in government, academia, and media organizations, and this was the situation until the rise of the advent of the internet. And it took a few years for the internet technology to be robust enough to facilitate a change in the paradigm, but indeed that did happen with the rise of social media in the first decade of the 21st century. The information gateway model became more decentralized and the information ecosystem became more polarized. On the one hand, we had no longer had to rely on these gatekeepers to disseminate information, which allowed less popular views to be propagated more easily. And there was also more participatory role for common citizens in this new paradigm. So initially, social media led to a democratization of media news and information. On the one hand, more ideologically extreme views could propagate more easily, and many people were constructing demi-realities that were very disconnected from accurate information. Inflammatory yellow journalism returned, and it was created and propagated by trolls, often funded by nefarious agents who had a lot of money. The advertising model for the internet and social media encouraged attention capture among the masses. There were incentives to attract more eyeballs to ads and for longer periods of time, which incentivized the platform creators and owners of the digital media spaces to create algorithms that would keep people on as long as possible by often inflaming passions and serving up sensationalized content that fed and amplified their pre-existing prejudices. Then led to the polarization of ideologies among large swaths of the population. Also, although the information content in your feed might appear to be from just average people and not media organizations, in recent years, with the rise of paid troll farms and AI generated content, these commentators who you might be interacting with can often be people paid to push a narrative or even AI bots that are then flooding the zone, intending to sow confusion to drown out legitimate checking, to relentlessly defend authoritarian leaders through rhetorical gymnastics that can even try to make any rational opposition to authoritarian leaders seem like the more extreme view, and other tactics that ultimately support anti-democratic agendas. So the question, can we have a new paradigm for collective wisdom?
Before you go there,
Yes.
Brandon, this point, we often say it, we all accept that the advertising model and the way digital media went and all of that. And I just think it's really interesting to stop for a minute and think of things like even from the end of the Fairness Doctrine in '84 under the uh, Reagan government as an example of media gets completely relieved of any responsibility to represent another opinion, right? That's a backdrop. The internet hadn't even arrived yet, right? So you get this explosion of media in an environment where there's no longer any responsibility. And in fact, starting in the '80s, you saw, the whole idea of any kind of public responsibility. Cable gets relieved of their public responsibility. You remember back to the early days of radio and broadcast, all the new media that appeared had a deep social responsibility, right? By comparison to what we have now. It seemed pretty light even then, but there was a responsibility. But by the time the Fairness Doctrine gets thrown out and digital media starts to hit in the late '90s, you've already got an environment where, the gloves are off. A new medium that's arriving now no longer is regulated by anything. And in fact, there's a belief amongst the capitalist class that any regulation is going to be bad, right? And then if you trace that through to the moment where, I guess 2009, probably when Facebook started to make its big transition. And by 2012, it's ridiculously profitable off of an advertising model. All the rules changed, right? And that's a really huge deal because think about that. In only 40 years, you go from having media, which has some desire to inform, some need to have a reputation, some need to deliver on sense making. Whether you agree or disagree with it, it actually cares about sense making, to now living in a world where nobody gives a shit about sense making, not in the main media, and surely not in our social networks. What they care about is the generation of revenue through traffic. which relates to advertisers, et cetera, and consumer society and all of that. So for me, at that point, I just come away and go, well, is there any surprise we're confused? Right? And to me, it's a really good place to just take a deep breath and realize what we're up against. This is non-trivial. We're talking about the entire remaking of any kind of socially mediated sense making, and instead now being thrown into the chaos of information coming from all kinds of places, which is why I go back to that argument. Basically the message is you aren't going to make sense of this. So, retreat, find yourself a mythic membership somewhere and hide out.
Okay. And you can you go ahead and read the last point there if you want, because it
Yeah.
segues
So
next thing.
there's this sense of what are the ways in which any kind of communal vetting of information can be reestablished so that there is collective sense making again. So the argument here is the argument being, well, we've been robbed of that collective sense making, even if it wasn't enough. It was something, and we used to uphold it as important. And now we're in this situation where these, as Brandon points out, we don't even have these basic sense of overlapping windows where some sort of peaceful coexistence emerges. And sitting with that and saying, well, what are the options? Like, where do we start? And so that's a question that I'd like to throw out to the folks here in the audience. And maybe if people are interested, like, where would you start? But to not back down, I'm going to also throw you out where I think we can start. And I'd be interested to see how you feel about that, but also what you think the alternatives are. If you believe this collective sense making is important, how do we get back to collective sense making? Because and maybe you think we've got it. I don't think we do. I don't think we have anything that looks like collective sense making. It's extremely difficult. And I think people feel terribly isolated.
All right.
Did you want to add anything to that, Brandon?
Well, I don't know. Let's see. I mean, there's these questions, is there a possibility for a transition to a new paradigm that is more wise, that enables greater collective wisdom? And, how can we move toward overlapping Overton window and peaceful coexistence? What injunctions, processes for direct apprehension, and communal vetting of information might be established to offer pathways for collective sense making?
Mm. So those are good questions, and I think it'd be good to just ask the audience to sit with that. And because what I'm about to do now is to jump into oh, yes, we can. And, you know, first of all, do you think the questions are valid? And second of all, do you have any idea of any sense of ways to get started? All right.
Any hands up yet? So should we just move to the next slide or get
Yeah.
another? Okay.
So I'm going to have a go at this to try to explain the goal being over there on the bottom left, communities generating trustworthy information. And the basic model here is to say that fundamentally we have to come back to small group sense making, that from a community building point of view, and I don't know if you've been following anything like the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and some of the publications they've put out over the last 6-7 years with the breakdown of civic community. And they do a really good job of laying that out. And that's a little bit of a backdrop of why I throw out the small group sense making. The sense making process itself really depends on the ability for a group of people to trust, have vulnerability with one another, and have some clear purpose together. If you think about the old model of journalism, it was actually based on something like this, even something as small as a radio station. People had a sense of purpose and calling. Here, what I'm arguing is that within our communities, we have to figure out how to circle together. And even it comes down to making specific issues, which really leads on to this idea of putting our editorial function on, well, what's of need in the community to come back to a really community focused. And a lot of journalists are trying to do this today. Nonprofit journalism makes attempts at trying to connect to community and report back to community in ways that are meaningful. But of course, nonprofit journalism is nonprofit and mostly broke. And the rest of the journalistic organizations have got rid of their reporters on anything that looks like local. So community interest doesn't really come into it. So I'll give you an example. Um, in the greater Sacramento area where I am, there's almost chaos with a number of different people who are working in different silos on homelessness or affordable housing. But the ability to aggregate all that into some sort of deeper view of the problem here regionally, it's not really happening. And it's, piecemeal. One journalistic organization may have a go, but there isn't anything holistic to what are two of probably the biggest problems we're all faced with. And yet on a local basis, we're not really engaged on the issue. So that raises the question of, well, how does a small group of people actually produce media? How do you publish any work you might do? So if 6 or 7 of us got together and decided we wanted to tackle an issue like affordable housing, where we wanted to go deeper, how would we do that together? Becomes a question. Like, what infrastructure is there to do that? And the answer is right now, there's none. There is no infrastructure for people to get together and make sense of things together. If you go look at an organization like New Public, which is a good reference I'll throw out, they're a really interesting organization who's busily trying to do things to create this kind of community fabric. It points to this idea that, well, together we can work on specific projects. And what I'm proposing here is that the project we work on is making sense of things that are really important to our communities, but to learn how to do that more collectively in our community rather than, it being a partisan approach or it being a specific, even political goal, but instead just do really old fashioned investigative research, understand, map, actually develop a deliberative approach. And this really falls back into small group sense making for the purposes of generating information, actually becomes a deliberative democratic act. Not something we're very good at. Deliberative democracy is not exactly widespread. So, this is pushing the envelope because the best we do is we do badly at representative democracy. But to actually come together in a deliberative way to understand the issues more deeply. And then the question becomes, if you're going to go through all that trouble, how are you going to reach out to your local audience? How are you going to propagate things? So those 4 points under small group sense making are the 4 color in that graphic. Now, from my analysis, you're not going to ever get to all that if you don't have some way of actually scaffolding or holding collective wisdom of the groups, of each group individually. And from what I've seen so far in the experiments I've run, we've got to have a set of collaboration tools we're using. There has to be really deep relational awareness in the group. This can't be just procedural, and it can't be fundamentally just performative. There's got to be an understanding that we're actually coming together relationally to do something and find deeper wisdom together, to both listen and learn, which is the next point, which is how do we create a learning environment together? And then finally, how do we create repositories of our shared knowledge and share our capabilities? So a lot of what I've just said, actually, if you go look at knowledge management in enterprises, for instance, you often touch on these very same things. You can even go read McKinsey articles that'll touch on these in different ways. But very few people talk about the formation of groups which have this kind of collaborative team structure, and I'll go further, I'm using the words collective wisdom, of proposing that actually in our communities, we need to start building teams like that. And they're not huge teams because this very thing I'm talking about is very difficult to do if you get beyond 7 people, maybe 10. There's a reality that to really be able to collaborate and get down to the depth of the issues and listen to one another and learn from one another, small groups are a heck of a lot more effective at doing that than any large group. There you go. So that's my proposition. Anything to add, Brandon?
Yeah, well, I think that much of this depends on kind of creating proto institutions,
Yeah.
and that in a sense we might actually be able to evolve the existing institutions that are there, to transform them, to co-opt certain aspects of them. This kind of gets into, I mean, we could have, like in the future, in a future event, we could talk about the two loops model. I mean, there's a lot of things that directions we can go with this, but the two loops model shows that there's dominant institutions that are, in some cases they're powerful for a while and then they start to decline. That's where we are. And then that there's a new emergent order that comes out from this bottom loop. And that's where, a lot of this integral metamodern liminal thinking is coming there. But that sometimes some of these legacy institutions can be repurposed or transformed somehow to be a part of this emergent order. And so this is what we're trying to start is creating new institutions from scratch in some cases that work differently, and I'm not sure if there might even be a possibility of beginning to add some of these processes into institutions that are already there.
Yeah, I think it's really important because if you can show the value, I'm putting in the chat an article that I really love. Jonathan Rowson of Perspectiva talks about the the three horizons model or the two loops model, which are pretty much the same thing as Brandon just pointed to. And in the article, one of the things that Rowson does a really good job of doing. Well, first I'll just set the simple level, right? Horizon 1 is the world we got. Horizon 3 is our imagination of what the world could be. Horizon 2 is what we think we could do now to start building toward Horizon 3. That's the desire. And that may be that the Horizon 2 experiments happen outside Horizon 1. We just say, okay, well, Horizon 1 is not going to help us, right? And I would throw up my hands and say, I'd really love for journalism to come to the party, except most of it is so advertising driven. I don't know how they're going to do that, right? The model, the world they live in now is about advertising and clickbait. And so how do you do that differently? It's very challenging for them. I think most journalistic organizations are deeply challenged in this. So what's sort of Horizon 2? So what I'm throwing out here is a Horizon 2 experiment, quite intentionally. And that's the approach I took. If I was starting from scratch and I was going to invent something totally new that's not the old system, but could potentially persuade the old system to change itself into a new system, what would that look like? What Rowson does in this article is raise this idea. Well, whatever you're doing, like to change this sense-making difficulty we all face, is it Horizon 2 plus? Are you doing a Horizon 2 thing that takes you in the new direction? Or is it actually Horizon 2 minus? So you get started out thinking you're doing something new and innovative, but it doesn't take you very long to realize, well, this is just going to get co-opted and not bring about any kind of real change. So that's one of the reasons I like the article. What I'm trying to do here is to throw out an idea that says, I think this could be Horizon 2 plus. It's difficult. I'll be the first one to say this isn't easy to build, and it's going to take a lot of experimentation to figure it out. But I think it can be Horizon 2 plus. Like we can invent how communities generate trustworthy information. We can actually do that. All right. Shall we open it up? Has anybody got any questions, comments, arguments?
Suppose we can close the presentation here. I'm not sure. Did you want to hold it on one of the slides or just kind of stop the share for now?
You might as well stop the share. If somebody asks, I guess we could get it back up.
All right. Arthur.
Yeah, with all of our phones, we all have phones and the technology and the computer in our pocket, from banking to media to social media. And then they design these apps so it keeps us on our phones longer with algorithms and things like that. And I maybe that's causing some polarization because when we're looking at it, it's giving us stuff that we want to see and maybe creating a confirmation bias.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We see a lot of that phenomenon happening. These platforms, they're incentivized to capture our attention. And consider in your life, for each of you, you only have so much time. You only have so much emotional energy to expend, so much mental effort that you could possibly expend, and also so much attention. I've actually been recently been reading a book called The Siren's Call by Chris Hayes, where he talks about how there's different conceptions of attention. Like I can intentionally focus on something, but then there's also certain things that can grab my attention that it's out of my conscious control. But when we're in this environment, this kind of hyper real environment, they're constantly trying to grab our attention. And in order to do just about anything, we need our phone, right? I mean, it's kind of the requirement to do just basic things, you know. So then you have any kind of apps you can add onto it, and they're all trying to grab your attention and your emotional and energy and your mental effort. They're trying to do that. So and your time for their own purposes. They're incentivized to do this because that's their business model. So we need ways of reclaiming that or protect or maintaining our own sovereignty. But in addition to that, we want to be well informed. So we have to have certain ways that we are certain processes through which we can become informed about what's going on, what's relevant to our lives, you know?
All right. Anybody else want to jump in? Or have we solved it all for everybody?
Can I jump in? I don't have any solving with this, but I had an idea based on small groups. Something called cellular democracy. It's something my friend um, had an idea about. I don't know how it would work in this context. I mean, I guess if it's about sense making, well, here the basic framework is, you know, I don't know, 5 to 10 of your closest friends, and amongst you, you uh, vote who would go up to another level of a council, who would all be 5 to 10 people or something like that. I don't. What the number is a little less important. I mean, as long as it's small enough that you know everyone in the group, and you continue to do that to a certain level. In this context, it would have to be funded somehow, like everyone would be chipping in. And the whatever level up you go, their job is you've chipped in a bunch of money, and their job is to make sense for the the group or whatever. So you'd have like the neighborhood cellular democracy or cellular council. Their only job is just to pick the next level up. So the neighborhood might um, choose the the ward council. Uh, I don't know how far up you would go for, like, I'm thinking of a media organization or a journalistic organization. Whatever level it would be, is that's the they are the decision makers for that region or city or however whatever size, and you know everyone, well, you know everyone within your group. The the one you select to go to the next group would know everyone in that group, and their job would be to select the next group. So at least they would know personally the person they're selected, and then whatever level is decided for to actually implement. In this case, it would be a journalistic endeavor. Uh, Everyone is pitched in a little bit of money. They get the money. Their job is to work hard on a particular um, field of knowledge or something like this. So I don't know if that would be helpful, but it seemed like that it was an idea that would be in alignment at least with what y'all are trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with you because it reminds me a little bit too of, have you heard of liquid democracy?
No, no, no.
So with liquid democracy, the idea is that we in our community we delegate our vote, if you will, we delegate our interest to somebody else who we trust in a category or around a particular subject matter or a particular issue. And then they have our proxy. So you start to hand your proxy to the people you trust. So people are basically voting on competence, right? Hopefully. You could just as easily vote on, cronyism. But the thing is you start to recognize the expertise in your community. And it's the same thing with your idea of this cellular democracy is I do actually envisage that these groups develop a way of relating to one another. And in fact, one of the next steps I want to do is to run a situation where we get three little groups and one group in each of three cities, which works on the same problem in this kind of structure, and then shares what they found in their own region and their own cities, just to see how much cross learning can go on. Because we don't have any structures like that now, where people look at their local issues. Coming from the idea of a complexity, a complex system is about local interactions creating global patterns, by definition. So it's interesting to explore that, how do those local interactions of your cellular democracy, how they start to create more wider global patterns. I'm curious too if anyone else has seen anything that starts to get at this. Sorry.
First, maybe we can go to Helen.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, my perspectives comes directly following what Marty was just saying, because I think a lot of this work is organically happening and has been for a few years. I think discussion groups like this, whether they were coming from spiritual perspectives about creating the world you want to see, or integral groups or complexity groups. I think people, I'm going to say at the higher level of consciousness, have been collecting for quite a while now, and we've seen a lot happen at local levels. We've got the whole notion of the Hello movement, and so I think one of the keys is going to be about how to how to encourage those small groups coming from whatever their common purpose is and value system is. It would be a mistake to try and connect them up and to come up with one formula and such. Like, you've lost the complexity, then you've lost the connection. I can't help. So my background's in organisational change, organisational transformation, and consulting. So I've taken many groups through the process of identifying values and mission statements. And so in the American context, I know people keep referring back to the Constitution, which is an amazingly astute document, I think. But just telling people to be to act by the Constitution. Well, that's been weaponised now and simplified. I think the groups each need to go through the process, because the key is the process of self-reflection and collective reflection on what are we about and what are we wanting to do and what is our purpose. Many times there would be models of best practice come out. Well, they're only best practice for the people where that model emerged. For other people to try and adopt what the best practice came out of, they're only going to achieve at best 50% of, or I'm just throwing a figure in there, of the impact of the people who originally did it. What was important was the groups that came up with what got determined as best practice model. It's the process that they went through that is important, not their outcomes. And so I can't help thinking there's a lot with that. So for me, it's recognising a lot of this is happening locally already, and working out how to, I don't know, how to support the emergence of more of these. So Thomas was just talking about a more formal process of how do you do it. So I don't know that I've thought that through yet, but for me, it needs to be values based. If you've got people at the higher level of consciousness that are driven by the principles and practices of integrity and the common good. Sorry, I have a 4-month-old puppy trying to get up on me. Then you trust what they're going to do. So that's as far as I'll go with that aspect of it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Andre.
Yeah, it seems like the recurring challenge is participation in a structure that facilitates it. So even before, so my perspective is that our culture and our political system and all of that has been built over time in the past. And today we have social media and infrastructure abundance. So if there was money at the end of this, I would suspect that there's some smart minds and capable people would quickly come up with a formula that would allow for the mass to participate in a structure that is intelligent and capable of handling complexity. Of course, that would start small, maybe like, I like the idea that Thomas was suggesting, but I think the challenge is it's not in our culture yet to exploit the infrastructures that are available to move our systems, like the political system, forward. I mean, so I'm going to try to shorten this very quickly. It seems to me that with the infrastructures that we have now, we can vote, everybody can vote every day. if we had something that was secure enough, intelligent enough to assure that the integrity of the process. So imagine that if you could vote every day. There's a topic, something of importance that comes up, and more of these come up quicker and quicker, and you can express yourself in a way that is secure, as if it was a vote. I don't know if I'm being clear, but basically, I think I've given it my best shot.
It sounds a little bit like what in ancient Greece they had a lot of. I'm not sure how frequently they would vote on all kinds of matters, but it was a direct democracy. I want to say that this is something that we could try to have at very small levels to begin with. You would need a lot of trust among people, and you would also need to be have people who are genuinely concerned about a lot of these matters that are happening that are put before them. I mean, a lot of people who I know are they have a hard time voting every 2 years. You know, they wouldn't want to be doing that every day. And then you'd end up with a capture among the people who are, genuinely have an interest in doing it. And then their votes matter. And the people who are maybe a little too busy to consider those matters every single day, well, their voices aren't actually heard. So, I mean, I can understand it being a little bit more frequently, but probably just at a, more at a local level, and using a certain kind of technology that would connect people to each other in communities, and then you're voting for certain matters that are of public interest within that community somewhat more frequently. Hard for me to imagine though this happening every single day.
Yeah, I was just pushing it to the extreme there, an exaggeration to illustrate that the infrastructure would be capable of that. Not that it would be a desirable thing, but at this time, we have the infrastructure, but we don't have, if you look at what social media is doing, we can clearly see that there's a potential for us to be able to express whenever we feel compelled and need to express. Whereas now we're sort of waiting for politicians to react to what's going on or what's happened in the past week. And sometimes, we have to wait till the next time we have a vote.
Okay, so yeah, before going back to Thomas, I want to know if anybody else who hasn't yet spoken would like to ask a question or offer some thoughts. And if not, then we'll go back to Thomas.
Have you all heard of a concept called citizen assemblies?
Yep.
I was thinking something like that. The small these small groups, I mean, with cellular democracy. I mean, I'm just spitballing here. So, could like the small group of the cellular democracy, at least you know the person you're voting for directly. That does make it harder for them to be captured because you know them directly, and they would vote for the next council and so on. So you get a certain high level council, which would be the citizen assembly. I'm going to just explain citizen assembly. Their job is like a jury. You wouldn't want the entire populace voting on the guilty or innocence of the guilt or innocence of a particular case that they have not been following, or worse yet, it's been followed on social media. And there's all sorts of crazy ideas of why they're guilty or innocent. So the whole idea of a jury is they will spend their time only focused on that particular instance. So the idea of a citizen assembly would be the same thing as we elect a group of people to focus on this housing affordability you were describing. And those were elected through steps up cellular democracy. So that ensures some integrity with the those who are elected. And there's no, I mean, this is beyond the formal functioning of our governments. So this, whatever they come up with is not going to be enforceable, but it would be it could be recognized that they spent their time looking into this, and here's what they found. That can be taken to your local city council or state senate or even the U.S. Congress, depending how high the cellular democracy level goes up. So I think that would work with something like, or it'd be a possibility. I mean, it's, I don't, in terms of wisdom, like, are they following these um, four, I'm not so familiar with John Vervaeke's stuff, but or they're familiar with the four quadrants or whatever. But I don't know. They might. So that was my 2 cents there.
Great. Thank you.
And what's interesting to me is that when we're talking about information evaluation and getting better information and the sociocultural fabric and how it relates to the information and collective wisdom, we end up we then need to focus on governance systems, on voting systems. And that's important. And in fact, there are one of the books that is very influential to me is Nordic Ideology by Hansi Freinacht. And some of you guys, I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with the work of Hansi Freinacht, who was, I mean, some will say that it was kind of a rebranded integral. I know there's some people within the integral community would say, okay, so you're basically rebranding integral, kind of toning down the spiritual aspect and calling it metamodernism, which is fine. That's but what I like is that they are oriented, that the real people behind Hansi Freinacht and the Hansi Freinacht character, it's oriented toward taking a lot of these integral ideas and applying them to the sociocultural, political, and economic spheres. And in this case, in this book, they have outlined what's called the Montesquieu 2.0 framework, looking at what kinds of institutions we need, how they can be specialized in different ways, how there can be a separation of concerns across them, and how they can interact with each other. And that there would be a whole class of institutions focused on information evaluation. And that's the so-called, what they call empirical politics. And then there would be other institutions focused on governance processes, and that would be the so-called democratization politics. And then they actually outline 4 others, and that these stand in relation to each other based on a certain kind of integral-like pattern, which is interesting. And that I think in order to really address this, we need to look at each of these as in their own right. Okay, we need better sense making, we need better governance, and then to round out that whole system would be a little bit off the topic here, but then they have others that are more aligned with like spirituality, and others that are more aligned with culture and community building, and others that are more aligned with emancipation, liberation, and And finally, based just on inner development itself, on, those sort of inner awareness, communicative processes, and ego development. So each of these are seen as important in their own right and all deserving their own institutional frameworks. And that you're not going to be expected to get any one institution that's going to be covering multiple bases simultaneously. So this is in fact the model that I found it really interesting, and I'm trying to figure out how can we apply this? How can we start to do this? In part through technology development, in part through bringing people together on these different, community circles based on these different functional areas.
And if I may, Brandon, I just want to pipe in and say yes. Obviously the Montesquieu 2.0 framework is really interesting. And I find, so I'm going to put something in the chat, like, so the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has thrown out a model around how to fortify civic culture in America, which is the link I'll put in the chat. And it's interesting, if you read through it, you can see that they're trying to find a framework for a multi-patterned approach to rebuilding that civic culture. And I hadn't had a chance to mention it to you yet, but I've been using this a lot, pointing it out to people without mentioning Montesquieu. But I think that, the idea that there's a lot of concern. I think it's a big deal that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is even paying attention, because it's an element of mainstream culture asking for transformation, which is, I think, pretty interesting. And I think this whole thing on sense making that we've done so far points to this idea of the breakdown of the institutions of sense making. And I got to the place where I go, well, I can't imagine how we're going to repair the old system. Like, throwing all my effort at trying to imagine how to repair that system feels like ain't going to go anywhere. I feel like I'll be throwing myself against the wall. But the idea of saying, well, how could we invent new systems, new ways of creating sense making and community? That seems like a way more productive, like new institutions, new ways of doing this.
All right. And
Cool.
I'm not sure, if we're maybe close to time here.
Yeah, we're getting on. Anybody got something they want to jump in with, or?
I'm just curious to find out if you would like to do this next month as well.
Yeah, one thing we were talking about is having something that would not only be on Integral Life, but could simultaneously be a part of what is called Limicon.
Limicon.
You heard of Limicon, Molly?
I've heard of it, but I've never attended it.
Yeah. It's liminal.
It's an online month-long unconference, and there's it essentially came from the attempts to formulate another Emerge gathering. You remember you were at the Emerge gathering in Austin. I know that you didn't think it was the best thing, but I thought it was pretty cool, actually. And I especially liked your presentation. But they were trying to come up with another one, and it's expensive. So last year they did it online, and they did it for a whole month, and they're doing it again this year.
Okay. Yeah, well, we can talk about that. We do have some sessions that are like co-hosted, so to say. So
Cool.
we could maybe we'll talk about that offline, Brandon and Marty.
Yeah. I'm curious, before people sign off, is there anything that you saw today, or that if you were here in previous ones, is there anything that comes up for you that you felt like you might want to hear more about, or you're curious about, that you want to direct us somewhere? Say, Brandon, Marty, go dig into that and bring something back.
Well, something that I suggest I think some of you know that there is a somewhat of a similar session to this one that Bruce Alderman and Mark Edwards run on Integral Life. I'd suggested to them, because they're kind of looking at meta narratives and meta theories and all that, about how maybe they could be useful in the arena of speaking about DEI, because it's such a hot topic right now. I'd offer the same to the two of you if there's
And
anything.
who better to talk about DEI than a couple of white
The
guys?
only,
Well,
the only
white,
person,
but
always the only person of color and immigrant and all that on these calls. Yeah, I'd love to, I'll just drop that. It doesn't mean you have to take it, pick it up, but
I mean, on the humor of that, there is the reality that, of course, it probably is a special responsibility for white guys to do something about DEI. So,
yeah. Yeah, anyway, yeah, that's one thing I would offer, because you guys have been offering these different toolkits that we can use, and different processes, different lenses. And I think for me, the only thing that is useful in the DEI conversation is the polarity method. It's really because it's really forcing us to look at both sides. Anyway, yeah. So cool. Well, I'm gonna hop off. Thank
all
you,
right.
Marty,
Thanks,
and thank
Marley.